Eugenia, well, it's a pleasure. My name, I remind you, is Roberto Palacio, and I'm a philosopher. I was once in academia, but I'm not now. I don't really believe that academia here, at least in Colombia, is producing many ideas that could be interesting. So I try to, I don't know if I think the word in English exists, divulgation. It's not used very much, but I try to spread around some ideas.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Well, but the topic, the main topic here is you today and your thought. I was looking at the basic information about you. You're a mathematician. You're a concert pianist. You cook. You like to cook. You're also a math teacher in a certain way. You taught math a very large audience. And the first thing I would like to ask you is, how do you manage to do all these things? With a certain, you've been successful in many of these things, and if not in all, and is there a common thread, or did you have to master each one of them?
I have just done things that I've enjoyed all the time and things that I felt were useful to the world. And when I was growing up at school, I was very lucky to have an education that encouraged many extracurricular activities. So I did many of them. And then when I went to university and did my PhD, I had this feeling that when you grow up, whatever that means, you have to focus and specialize in one thing. So for a while, I really did focus on my mathematical research because I thought I was having a career in that. And when I got a permanent job as a professor at the University of Sheffield in the UK, I realized that that focus and that kind of narrow focus on one thing did not satisfy me. And so I started working out ways to bring back more of those things that I felt were more worthwhile and also more satisfying to me personally. And that's why I changed the direction of my career and quit my job as a normal math professor so that I could do what we call a portfolio career, where I brought back all of those other things that I love doing and that I think are worthwhile for the world, because I really believe it's important to think about the things that you're good at and see how you can make use of that combination of things to make a difference in the world in the best way that you can. And I felt that for me, that meant doing more of those things, not just focusing on one of those things. So that's what I do now. And I am much happier, much more personally fulfilled, but I also think that I'm having a greater impact on more people.
Yeah. Part of this interview, I would like to speak about through some of the topics about education, and because for us Colombians, Colombian children have a really tough time with math, and they have a really tough time learning language skills and trying to relate different things like these two, language skills and math, or language skills and politics and being a citizen. What I would like to ask you, you were referring to that. Should children focus on one thing and maybe master other things later on, or should they try to learn many things at the same time? And again, I asked myself, I mean, being a concert pianist and a mathematician, is there a common structure there? I read this very interesting book by Daniel Barenboim. I'm sure you know who he is. And he writes this magnificent book about music. And the sense of harmony, he says, can teach you something about ethics. But I don't know. Have you had that experience yourself?
I do think that everything is related to everything else, and that if we narrowly focus and separate things into subjects, then we're really losing something. And I think it's a bit like if you go to the gym and you use a machine that only does one muscle at a time, it's very artificial. And using your body in the world involves using combinations all the time. And it's the same with our brains, that if we separate subjects out, it may enable us to get very good at specific things. But life isn't like that. Life is about joining everything up and using all our brains at the same time. And I think that, moreover, if we separate things up, some children get told they're bad at some things, and so then they put that aside and focus on something else. And so some children find that they get low scores in math at a young age, so they decide to focus on something that has less of a concept of right and wrong. And because art subjects have less of a concept of right and wrong, maybe they prefer writing or drawing or something. And then on the other way around, the children who score well in maths think, oh, well, they're good at something like that. And then we get the impression that languages are separate and different. And that means that the people who are good at math think they have to focus on that and not on languages, when really everything is related, because we use logical think, or we should use logical thinking and analytical skills in every aspect of life, even if it's something that has slightly less right and wrong answers. But really there's a whole spectrum, because language does still have some right and wrong things, and the structure of language is to some extent very logical, even if the way we use language can then be very creative. But at the same time, the way we use mathematics and the way we work through mathematics can also be very creative. And so I think that it's limiting to call one of them logical and the other one creative.
I would like to go there in a short while, but let me ask you, why is math so difficult for many children? Why do you think that happens?
I don't think it needs to be. And I think that it is something that the education system really, I wish the education system would sort it out. And I think that one of the reasons is that it focuses so much on right answers. And the very first experience that children have of math education is usually from elementary school teachers who are not math specialists. And I don't know how it works in Colombia, but certainly in the US and in the UK, where I have most experience, specialist math teaching doesn't start until much later. And so elementary school teachers have to teach all subjects. And usually the people who are drawn to doing that are not people who are math specialists, the kinds of people who are drawn to teaching the smallest children. And so they're often people who are not comfortable with math themselves. And small children can ask really profound, difficult questions about mathematics that can be very terrifying to try and answer if you're not a mathematician. But unfortunately, the people teaching them are usually not mathematicians, so maybe they don't know how to answer those kinds of questions. And so then it becomes safer to keep the math to very strict, rigid things that have correct answers. Plus, I don't know, again, how it is with your education system, but in the US and the UK, it has become so focused on standardized tests, and teachers get evaluated on the scores that the students receive. And this puts awful pressure on them just to teach them how to get better scores in those tests. And that's a horrible situation to be in. And I think that it's not a result of math that people get afraid of it. It's a result of that structure. I think that if we taught art in that way, with tests and right and wrong scores and ranking everybody according to those scores, I think people would be afraid of art.
Yeah, no doubt about it. In Colombia, it's the same way that you're saying. A teacher would teach everything from math to citizen basic skills and literature, and for the very small children, even for the bigger children, it works like that. They are taught, and it goes farther beyond that. One same teacher will teach children age 6, age 7, age 8, in very poor and far away places in Colombia. It works like that in the same classroom. So it makes perfect sense what you're saying. So let me ask to start emerging to your topics. Let me ask the great. I used to teach logic, of course, set theory, but not category theory. That was a long time ago. How does math relate to the world. And the question I asked you before has to do with the abstract, at least the perceived abstract nature of math.
Mm-hmm.
So how is it semantically relevant? Why does math speak about the world? I mean, I remember a student of mine many years ago when I was teaching logic. He said, "Oh, why do you teach logic?" And I gave a somewhat stupid answer and said, "To make you think better. If it's about thinking, you could teach chess." And I've thought about that through the years. So the question is, how does math uh, show the relevant structures and relationships in social life and in nature and in other things?
It is a very big question. And I think it's important to understand what abstraction is first. And to me, abstraction means where you forget about some details of a situation so that you can focus on some logical core of it. And the traditional, and I used to think this as well, a traditional attitude towards abstract math is that it's very removed from real life and that it's floating in the clouds somewhere. And I thought my research would only ever be relevant to other mathematicians, and that other mathematicians' work would be relevant to applied mathematicians, and then applied math would be relevant to science, and science would be relevant to engineering. And it would go down this very narrow chain of knock-on effects and then be relevant to very specific parts of the world, like building bridges and developing planes and engines. But now I realize, like you, that logic and abstraction, abstract math, is about how to think more clearly. And yes, it's true that chess does that to a certain extent as well, but I think that abstract math is more abstract than chess. And as a result, there's a point to getting further away from real life, which is that you encompass more examples in that process. And so one of my favorite ways to express this is that if we think about two bananas and two apples, then we can say abstractly those are both two things, and that's very abstract. It's gone away from the real world. We could say they're two fruits, which is closer to the real world. We haven't forgotten quite so many details. But when we say two fruits, that doesn't include so many possible examples. Whereas if we say two things, that can now include two chairs or two countries or two families. And so the point of becoming more abstract is to be able to examples. And for my art students, that's really key, because in the traditional ways of studying math, all the examples tend to be very, very specific things, like you throw a ball in the air and what path is it going to take, or something like that, or something is accelerating at this rate and when is it going to crash? And those kinds of things don't interest them very much. But if you look at abstract math, then I found that I can apply it to questions like racism and social justice and inequality. And those things are the things that they really care about. And so it makes math more relevant to more people.
Why do we go there? Why? I would like to ask you, can you explain in simple terms, how do you do this? What is this that you are proposing about using math to explain, for example, gender issues? Could you give us an insight?
Yes, it's, I don't know how simple or quick it will be, but I realized that because I am a pure mathematician, I'm so deeply trained in the discipline of pure mathematics that I use that all the time in everything I think about. But I don't do it consciously. But I realized that in order to explain it to my students, I needed to bring into consciousness the way in which I'm using it. Because of course, one of the wonderful things about teaching is you have to understand things much more deeply to explain them to people who don't understand them. And so this is why I love teaching art students. When I was teaching math students, I didn't have to understand things quite so deeply to explain them. But to art students, I have to explain them deeply. And it all started in the 2016 fall semester when the election was happening in the US, when they were so upset and anxious about the election, as was I, that it became more and more important to talk about the issues they cared about in my classroom. Because if I did not talk about the issues they cared about, they wouldn't care about my lessons. And so I realized that I could talk about the issues that were happening in politics through the lens of abstract mathematics. And in a way, the mathematics I use is often very simple, but it's the principle of being able to use abstract structures to shed some light on those situations and to clarify what's going on. And for example, to understand that there are power imbalances and that you can make analogies between the power imbalances, for example, that men generally have over women, and that white people generally have over non-white people, and that rich people generally have over less rich people, and that those power imbalances cause people's experiences to be different in other ways up. So that, for example, the relationship of men to women is not, in that sense, the same as the relationship of women to men. True. And I like to say, instead of just arguing, we can say, well, there is a sense in which that is true. And both cases are people being exclusionary towards other people, and that's always bad. But in one case, there's an extra thing that makes it different, which is the power imbalance, the power that men generally hold in society over women. And so in that sense, it is not analogous. And being able to find a sense in which things are the same and a sense in which things are different is actually, I think, a very central part of the discipline of abstract mathematics, because we're always looking for ways in which things are the same that help us understand the ways in which they are different. That's fundamentally what an equation is. We just don't usually think of it like that. An equation says something equals something, but those two sides have something different about them in the first place. Otherwise, we wouldn't bother saying the equation. So for example, if we say 1 plus 2 equals 2 plus 1, that helps us to understand that we can do addition both ways round. But 1 plus 2 and 2 plus 1 have something different about them to start with. Otherwise, there would be no point stating the equation. We wouldn't learn anything. So it's always about finding ways in which things are not the same and also the same, and expanding our understanding in that way. And that general abstract principle, it's not a very complicated piece of mathematics, but it's quite a profound attitude and a way of thinking. And that, to me, is how abstraction can help us understand the world, and that then thinking about the world in this way can help my students to feel more attraction towards the field of abstract mathematics.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have many questions there that I don't have written down, but you say, for example, power generally is held by men. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, reading your books and some of your stuff, I can see that you have a very, I agree with that point very much, that averages are so deceitful. You know, I've been in many meetings with feminists that they ask men to renounce their privileges. And I find out that they have more privileges than I do many times, and that men are object and we are victims of the power of other men too. So I don't know if that generalization always holds. I don't know how you see that.
Well, it's important to understand what structural power means. It doesn't mean that every individual man has power over every individual woman. And it doesn't even mean that in every situation, the men in that situation have more men historically. Until really quite recently, women weren't allowed to participate, they weren't allowed to have an education, they weren't allowed to own property, they weren't allowed to do things without the permission of either their father or their husband, and they weren't allowed to have jobs. And there are still many ways in which that carries on, albeit a bit more subtly. For example, until recently and still now, a lot of scientific research is only done on male subjects. It's not done on female subjects because female subjects are considered to be too complicated or something. And so, for example, car safety was only tested on male model dummies until quite recently. They tried to implement testing it on female models, but all they did was shrink the men. And women aren't just smaller men, they have a completely different muscular distribution. And so the safety measures were found to be actually increasing the dangers to women because of, for example, the height of the airbag and the way that it hit women's bodies differently. And so those are some more subtle ways in which, even if individual women may have a lot of power, there are still these things embedded in the assumptions of society that hold women back. And yes, it's true that there are some very rich and powerful women who have much more power in society than some not rich men at all. And so that's one of the places in my book where I drew some diagrams to understand, to try and explain and understand the interactions between those things. And that male privilege doesn't mean that every man is more privileged than every woman. It means that if any individual man were exactly the same person, but also female, then they would be even worse off. And that's very difficult. I understand that that's difficult, especially for poor white men to get comfortable with, because if they get told they're privileged, it can feel really bad if you don't feel like you're doing well in the world. You feel like you're struggling, that you've worked hard all your life. Maybe you feel that you've worked really hard from very poor beginnings in life and you have struggled and nobody helped you. And then, yes, you feel very bitter about people going on about how privileged you are. And I think that that was important for me to understand from an abstract structural point of view. And so what I find is that when I draw abstract diagrams, it kind of takes everyone one step away from the emotional link. It's very important to be able to detach the emotions and also know when to put them back in again, to try and understand. Just like if I'm thinking about the argument of somebody who really disagrees with me, then it can be very confusing if I'm very upset by what they're saying. You know, maybe they're insulting or maybe they are doing all sorts of things. But if I use an abstract mathematical structure inside it, then I can be calmer about understanding their point of view. And that is a way in which I think abstract mathematics has helped me to empathize with people who think differently from me.
Mm-hmm. In your books, you speak about when you manage to get to this abstract mathematical level, that let's say that structure of the problem, and you can even think about a proving things. Well, I don't know if I really don't know if I got the point wrong. I always thought that a mathematical proof was somewhat neutral, and things could go the way you want them, or they could go the other way. So you could end up proving that things that you don't like are true. If I can give you an example from another discipline, that was a famous debate between a feminist called Ruth Bleier. I think she passed away some years ago, and neurology. And she would say, neurology, it's done by men, so it must be a fake thing. It must be ideologically charged, and so on and so forth.
Neurology?
Neurology. Yeah, the study of the brain. And when I read this, I thought, but can't science show us things that we don't want to hear and that we don't agree with? Maybe math has this to it. It might show us that things are the other way around.
The thing is that it can happen in math, because in math we're working in a very abstract world, but all that mathematical proofs ever do is start from some basic axioms and then prove what all the consequences of those axioms are. And if you change your axioms, then you get different results. And so, for example, in ordinary numbers, there are certain things that just are mathematically true in the ordinary numbers. For example, we cannot have infinity in the ordinary numbers because that would cause a contradiction. We might want infinity to be true, but we can get that to be true by moving world and using some different basic axioms. And so in mathematics, we can dream up things to be true, but we have to have different starting axioms. And what I think about using mathematics to understand the world around us is that everybody has different basic starting axioms because they have different basic starting beliefs. And so it's like to take the starting point that everybody is logical according to their system of logic, which might have very different starting points. And it might be that they don't believe in the principles of scientific evidence. And if that is one of their basic starting points, then yes, they will logically arrive at some very different conclusions. And there is no way for me to say that the principles of scientific evidence are more correct than something else. They are just some principles, and that if we choose to believe in them, then we will believe in science. And if we choose not to believe in them, then we won't. And then for me, the great thing about that is that once we've understood that, if we recognize that somebody doesn't believe in the principles of scientific evidence, there's no point showing them more and more evidence because they don't believe in those principles. What we need to do instead is go further to the root and understand why they don't believe in those scientific principles. And there may be some very, very profound reasons that they don't. Maybe something has happened to them that goes against scientific principles, because of course, the principles of evidence only show things up to a certain percentage of probability. And so there's always the possibility that something different can happen. And if that happens to you in a very profound and disturbing way, then maybe that will cast doubt on all of those principles. Moreover, maybe it's that many people don't understand percentages well, and they don't understand what probability means. And so that maybe what we need to do is teach a better understanding of probability, and that 95%, something being 95% probable doesn't mean that it's definitely going to happen. And then if the opposite happens, it doesn't mean that that theory was wrong, because that theory took into account the possibility of something else happening. And so I think that understanding other people's point of view all the way to the root of their own basic principles is really an important key to understanding each other better. And one of the things I try to say all the way through my book is that the point shouldn't be to try and prove that we're right and someone else is wrong. I think the point should be to try and reach greater understanding about how we're all kind of on a gray area, really, and that we all believe different things to different amounts. And if we can get ourselves into a gray area, there's much more chance for finding some kind of consensus rather than being split up into black and white all the time.
Sure. But let me see if I get you right. Does that mean that your starting point, math will only develop these starting premises and show you where they go ultimately, or does it actually transform the vision you have about those starting points? Because if it does only develop these starting points, should it be very important in your life story and stuff like this?
I think, yes, you can, but then what you would have to do is show what your basic starting points are and how you have developed your logic from that position. And that using very clear logic illuminates what you have assumed in that process. And so, yes, it's a tool, and all tools can be used in also any sorts of ways. And math is not about absolute truth. It's about logical implication. So it's about seeing what follows from something else. And what I think about gender imbalances, and that's very interesting because that's the subject of my most recent book, is that, yes, it is possible that there are some reasons to expect gender differences in mathematics. However, I think that's just a different question. What I believe is that there are unfairnesses in the system. And so regardless of what numbers we're looking for in the end, we should still get rid of the unfairnesses in the system. There's no reason not to get rid of the unfairnesses in the system.
Aurelie told me that how's your Spanish? That you might be able to read some parts of your book in Spanish.
Yes, my Spanish is not what it used to be, but I did study in school, and I will try to read a little bit of the beginning of this book, and I hope it's not too painful to listen to.
Which book is it? Your last one?
This is from the one that is released in Spanish.
Okay. El arte de la lógica. Good. Fine.
El mundo está atestado de discusiones horribles, conflictos, divisiones, fake news, victimismos, explotaciones, prejuicios, fanatismos, culpa, gritos y una limitada capacidad de concentración. Cuando los memes de gatos captan más atención que un asesinato, ¿significa que la lógica ha muerto? Cuando un encabezado de prensa se hace viral sin importar su veracidad, ¿significa que la racionalidad se ha vuelto irrelevante? Demasiado a menudo, la gente pronuncia frases simples y dramáticas para producir un efecto, para impactar, para ser aplaudido y para intentar conseguir ser el centro de atención en un mundo donde todo el tiempo y de forma despiadada infinitas fuentes compiten por nuestra atención. Las simplificaciones excesivas nos empujan a situaciones de blanco y negro. Parece que vivimos con un constante ruido de fondo, cargado de fuerte crítica, desacuerdos y grupos de gente atacando a otros grupos, ya sea de manera figurada o real. ¿Se ha perdido toda esperanza? ¿Estamos condenados a tomar partido, a quedar atrapados en nosotros mismos para nunca más ponernos de acuerdo? No. Existe un chaleco salvavidas disponible para todos los que están ahogándose en el ilógico mundo contemporáneo. Y ese chaleco es la lógica. Pero, como todo chaleco salvavidas, solo nos ayudará si lo usamos bien. Y para ello, debemos no solo entender mejor la lógica, sino también entender mejor las emociones y, lo más importante, la interacción entre ambas. Solo entonces podremos usar la lógica de manera verdaderamente productiva en el mundo humano real.
Oh, fine. And your Spanish has, well, it's perfectly comprehensible. Very good. Fine.
Thank you.
And what a beautiful passage. Let me ask you something about that. I know it exceeds a little bit the frame of our interview, but why do you think that that's happening? Why are people so? I mean, why is it so difficult to get people to discuss in the same logical terms?
I think certainly in the US, it's a basic problem of education, and it's been exacerbated by some political parties and media outlets who understand all too well that emotions are much stronger than logic. And so they focus on stirring up people's emotions. And then the other people believe so much in rationality that they don't appeal to people's emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And if we pit emotions against logic in a battle, then logic has no chance, I think. Emotions will always win. Whereas what we need to do is use them both. And so I understand this from teaching mathematics, that if we teach mathematics to people without ever invoking any emotions, without ever appealing to emotions and intuition, then nothing will really go in, only to a very small number of people. And so I think that that's why I say it's important to use emotions and logic together. And unfortunately, while some people are stirring up emotions, do it more and more, absolutely regardless of any kind of logic or truth or evidence or anything, as we've unfortunately particularly seen in the US recently. And because they stand to hold so much power, everyone else hasn't, I think they haven't figured out how to sort themselves out and do something about it. And that's why I wanted to try and write this book, to try and help somebody in this situation, because I always think I don't want to just sit around and complain. I don't want to just sit and whine and complain about things. I want to try and do something to help. And I thought, what can I, as an abstract mathematician, do? And what I realized is that what I do in my personal life is I use the discipline of abstract mathematics to understand why everyone is taking the position they're taking, rather than just going, oh, they're stupid and they're irrational, they're illogical. I feel I can understand them, and whenever other people go, I can't believe that anyone thinks this, I always think I can believe it. And if there's something that if I really don't know why someone thinks something, I sit down and think harder to understand what is the root of what they're doing. And I think that there are just not enough people doing that, which is why I wanted to write this book.
That's true. I actually am trying to impose a project that will teach Colombian children to think critically. And well, we're trying to do our best, because I have the same perception. But speaking about what you just said, I don't think it's always a matter of logic against emotion. Let me give you a concrete example. For example, the NRA, when it says the solution to avoid these school shootings and these horrible things that we've seen lately. And some people say, oh, well, try to limit gun sales. Okay. And the NRA people say, oh, no, give each child a gun. And you'll see that if each child has a gun, when a shooter comes into school, he won't last a second. So and people have different logics, and the big question is, which one is the real logic? And there might not even be a real logic, but how to measure that? How to understand that?
I think all of the logic is real, and that may be a controversial position for me to take. But when I say that everyone's logic is real, I'm not validating their point of view. There are many very many of us would consider evil, but in that particular case, I think that what I have realized is that for some people, believing in guns is a basic principle of theirs. And so everything that follows from that follows absolutely logically from their fundamental belief in guns. Whereas other people, like me, fundamentally don't believe in guns. I mean, I grew up in England where there isn't such a gun culture. And so if you fundamentally don't believe in guns, then even if some kind of logic would give you the conclusion that if everyone had a gun, there'd be less mass shootings, we still wouldn't agree with it because we don't believe in guns. And so that is why both sides can call each other irrational. But I think that it comes down to a complete mismatch in our basic fundamental principles.
Well, could you expand a little bit more about this mismatch in our fundamental principles? Does that mean some believe that the starting point is this, and others believe that the starting point is this other point? That's what you refer to?
Yes. So I have a fundamental basic belief that we should not all have guns. And so even if at some level it would prevent more mass shootings, I still don't believe that everyone should have a gun. And whereas other people believe that it would be great if everyone had a gun. And so of course it follows very logically from that every child in school should have a gun. And you can see this if you even look at, sometimes a terrible tragedy happens where a 2-year-old child is killed by their parent's gun in an accident. And you might think, finally, that parent won't believe in guns anymore. And then if you see an interview with the parent, you'll say to that parent, well, my child is now with God, and God has chosen them to go to them now. And so I'm fine with that. And once you see that even after a parent's own child has been killed by an accident with their gun, they still believe in guns. To me, that has helped me understand how deep their belief in guns is.
Yeah, it's for me, it's wild. It's crazy. I really can't grasp that. Part of the problem for me, at least, is that people are not discussing in the same terms. You have your logic, I have mine, and according to mine, for example, proof is not relevant. Okay, so how? And the big question I always ask myself: how can we discuss with people that have such a different? It's not about the facts. You can even agree on the facts. It's about the way you think. So at the same time, and many of those logics are not logical, really.
So I first of all, as a mathematician, I think I'm very comfortable with the idea that there are many different logical systems, and that all axioms provide a different system, because all mathematicians study different mathematical structures in which different things are true. And so I have become very comfortable with the idea that every human has their own logical system, and some of us overlap more than others of us. And I really don't believe in calling other people illogical. Even if they can't explain their own logic, I continue to believe that I can understand their logic, that someone can understand their logic, and that I will do so. And I've taken it upon myself to try and do so. And I'm taking a little break at the moment because we will get exhausted. But for a while, I would make sure I read on the internet every day comments that made me ill, to make sure I was aware of the worst things, the furthest away things that other people think. And I was doing this during the pandemic because I want to understand things like why some people don't believe it exists, and why some people believe the vaccines are a hoax, and why some people think that masks are making things worse. And I think what is very important to me is to understand that there are some people who are so far away from our basic principles that we might not be able to reach them right now. But that's not most people. I don't think that that is most people. There are a lot of people who are much closer, and there are many people who, for example, have the same basic principles as me, but don't know how to use logic in the clear way that I do. So they actually want to think the way that I do, and I can definitely help them. And then there are people whose principles aren't so far away, and that using the principles of logic, we can see how close our overall approach is just from a slightly different basic starting point. And so if we look at the people who are most extreme, then we will get very depressed about not being able to talk to them. And I say, we don't have to talk to them first. We can build up gradually and first talk to the people who are a bit closer, and then those people can talk to the people who are a bit closer. And most importantly, if we sit down and look at the people who are most extreme, and then we get depressed and give up, because we think we'll never be able to change anything, then it will become true. Because if we give up, then we won't be able to do anything. And so I know I am a bit of an idealist, and I'm an optimist, and I think that you have to be in education, because you have to believe that it's possible to help the next generation do better. And I continue to believe that. And so that's why I continue to believe that if we educate people better in this way, there will be a small better. And I think we can.
Okay, so just to get clear, so you think that eventually you can get more people to speak a common language? Huh?
Yes, and I think fundamentally speaking a common language is a good way of putting it, because it doesn't mean that we'll all agree in the end, and I don't think we can ever expect that. But if we can at least, as a starting point, have less divisive arguments and spend time talking to each other to find common ground or to understand each other rather than to beat each other down, then I think we'll be able to just shift the world a little bit back. And that just like with reducing risks of infection for COVID, we don't have to do everything all at once. If we can find just a few ways to shift everything a little bit in some less divisive direction, then I think all of that will multiply, and we'll be able to move forward in a way that might be less divisive.
So I have the last two questions for you, and the one I want to ask you right now has to do with another very beautiful passage of your book, X plus Y. I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to give you some hints of what I read here. And you say that math is about dreaming up worlds, and the worlds that can be better than the actual world.
Mm-hmm.
That for me as a philosopher makes perfect sense. Possible worlds, and worlds in which traits that are not really relevant will not have the power to put you back. Yeah. Can you expand a little bit on the world you dream of?
Yes. That book is all about how I think we could think about character traits more and think about which character traits we value in people, rather than it's a book about trying to stop being stuck in gender battles with each other. And I started by thinking about the world of mathematics, because as you mentioned earlier, math is very male dominated, and maybe there are some reasons for that, but there are also some ways in which I think we're definitely filtering for the wrong character traits in mathematics. So for example, we evaluate people according to how well they do in exams. And exams are a very short space of time. I don't know how they are with you, but with us, they're usually 2 hours or sometimes 1 hour. And you have to answer as many questions as possible in a short space of time. And we use that to pick people to become research mathematicians. And that's just irrelevant. It's not the link between your ability to do that and your ability to do research is very thin. And so that we use the wrong thing to pick who's going to be allowed to progress. Just like, for example, when we're having elections and we expect politicians to do things like make speeches or have a debate where they defeat everyone else's point of view. Whereas actually running a country is about much more than making speeches and defeating people's arguments. It's about trying to find consensus among different people and listening to what people need and balancing out different needs. And so I think that that's another situation where we are filtering for the wrong characteristic for something that is much more complex or much less dramatic than that. And another example that's more specific is playing music. I play music as well, but I see that the music world is increasingly about competitions. You have to win competitions and you have to perform under great stress and beat other people. Whereas actually playing music is about sharing something beautiful with many people. But we insist that people undergo this very stressful situation in order to let them be someone who will share this music with people. And so maybe often the people who are most equipped to share beautiful music are not the same ones who will be able to withstand the awful pressure of competitions and being criticized in public. And so I think there are many situations in which we are filtering for the wrong characteristics.
Yeah, I totally agree. This whole idea of examination is so absurd sometimes. Take people, you put them in a stressful situation and you say perform. And it doesn't work like that. And I'm sure in music, it doesn't work like that either. You need time, you need silence, you need, I don't know, you need many things that might not be there in that examination context. So we've come to our last question, and the last question is, Colombia, my country, is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and not only in Latin America, in the world, in the whole world. And we've had recent situations that have to do with this. People are on the streets. There are manifestations and different types of events. Can math really help us overcome that inequality? Can math help us, and how could you imagine that?
First of all, I'm very sorry to hear that about your country, and it's one of the things I talk about in both of my books. In the last book, X plus Y, is about how the structures that exist in society benefit a really very small number of people. And just like we've seen in the pandemic, a small number of multi-billionaires in the world has got richer and everybody else has not. And so the number of people who benefit is quite small. And if everybody else were able to collaborate with each other, then we would be able to change that, because everyone else is in a very vast majority. It's just that the people who hold power are very good at holding on to power. And one of the things they do is that they sow discord or encourage discord among everybody else to make sure that those people will not be able to collaborate with each other to overthrow them. And I think that this is one of the big problems where people get into arguments about who is more oppressed than who and who is more disadvantaged, and what we call the oppression Olympics here, where if you're not the most oppressed person, then you're not allowed to speak. And this is, I think, all a subtle, or not very subtle, an implicit tool that is built up by the people who currently hold power to make sure that everybody else fails to unite in any way. And I think that if we can find ways to accept our differences and find some common ground so that we can unite and work together, then we will be able to change the status quo and change who holds the power, because I do think that there are more of us, and that if we work together, maybe we can change that.
Yeah, we can take this world back in our hands. Well, Eugenia Cheng, it's been a pleasure. I didn't ask you about the abstract mathematical stuff I would have liked, but I'm thinking about the people that will hear us in the book fair in August. And thank you very much. When do you know Colombia? Have you ever been here?
No, I haven't. I was supposed to come for the festival last year, but then of course things intervened.
Yeah, okay. I hope you do soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.